I am 62 years old, and for 40 of those years, the scent of industrial adhesive, heated corrugated pulp, and machine oil has been permanently settled into my skin. I never wanted to be a corporate shark. I never aspired to wear a bespoke suit or spend my afternoons drinking scotch at the country club while other men broke their backs to make me rich. I just wanted to build something sustainable, take care of the people who worked for our family, and go home to my late wife Sarah feeling like I hadn't compromised my soul. In my family, that philosophy made me a liability. It made me a target for endless ridicule. It made me, in their exact repeated words, too soft. To understand how this all unraveled, how a multi-million-dollar manufacturing empire was brought to its knees by a single man who was supposedly too weak to lead it, you have to understand Caldwell Industrial Packaging and the family that ran it. My grandfather started the company in 1972 in a gritty, hard-working town in Ohio. We manufactured specialized, heavy-duty corrugated packaging. If a major automotive company needed a reinforced, shock-absorbing crate to ship a 2-ton engine block across the country without a scratch, they called us. When my grandfather passed away in the early 90s, my father, Richard, who is now 85 and still possesses the stubborn, aggressive temperament of a cornered badger, took over as CEO. My father is a man who genuinely believes that the 1980s corporate raider era was the peak of human civilization. He is loud, unapologetically ruthless, and subscribes to the archaic management philosophy that employees only work hard when they are terrified of starvation and eviction. Then there is my older brother, Marcus. Marcus is 65 and he is essentially my father cloned, but entirely stripped of the microscopic amount of grit and actual work ethic the older generation possessed. Marcus is the golden child. He wears $4,000 Brioni suits to walk a factory floor where the median income is $55,000 a year. He drives a Porsche Cayenne to work, spends his days networking on the golf course with local politicians, and unironically refers to himself as a market disruptor. He has a wife 30 years his junior who spends her time redecorating their mansion and complaining about the smell of the town we live in. And then there's me, Arthur. I started sweeping the factory floor when I was 16. I drove the heavy forklifts at 18. I skipped the prestigious out-of-state business schools my father wanted me to attend and instead went to a local state college for supply chain management so I could keep working the night shift. I came back full-time as the floor supervisor and eventually became the director of operations. I knew the name of every single person on that floor. I knew that Tom, our veteran shipping coordinator who had been with us for 25 years, had a daughter with severe medical needs, so I spent 3 months fighting our HR department and my father to make sure our company health insurance tier stayed high enough to cover her treatments. I knew that Maria in quality assurance was working a second job to put her twin boys through college, so I quietly authorized her for maximum overtime whenever we had a rush order, hiding the extra labor costs in the maintenance budget so my brother wouldn't notice. For the last 20 years, I basically ran the entire company. My dad spent his time at the country club, and Marcus, who was technically our executive vice president of sales, spent his time losing massive client accounts because he constantly tried to aggressively upsell them on premium features they didn't need. I was the one who made sure the massive die-cutting machines actually ran, the raw materials were sourced cheaply without sacrificing quality, and the orders went out on the trucks on time. We were doing incredibly well. We weren't a Silicon Valley tech startup, but we were a quiet, unglamorous juggernaut pulling in about $18 million a year in gross revenue with a very comfortable profit margin. But my father and my brother were never ever satisfied, and they constantly berated me for my management style, viewing my empathy as a terminal business disease. The first major fracture happened about a decade ago. I had just approved a $45,000 expenditure to completely overhaul and upgrade the ventilation and air filtration system in the main cutting room. The old system was failing, the air was thick with paper dust, and the guys were coughing. It was a health hazard. My father called me into his massive, mahogany-paneled office. Marcus was already there, swirling a glass of midday bourbon. "You are bleeding us dry, Arthur," my father snarled, throwing the invoice across the desk at me. "Dad, the air quality on the floor was barely passing OSHA standards," I replied, keeping my voice level. The men were getting chronic headaches and respiratory issues. It's a massive legal liability, and beyond that, it's just morally wrong to make them breathe that garbage in for 12 hours a day. Marcus scoffed from the leather sofa. "You're too soft, little brother. They are factory workers, blue-collar labor. If they don't like a little dust, they can go work at a fast food joint. You spend our capital like a bleeding heart socialist. You need to squeeze the margins, Arthur. You don't coddle the labor force. You manage them." "I am managing them," I shot back. "Which is why our turnover rate is less than 2%. While your sales team has a revolving door because you scream at them every time you miss your own impossible quotas." Marcus stood up, his face flushing red. I bring in the revenue. I'm the face of this company." My father slammed his hand on the desk. "Enough, Arthur. You will cancel this ventilation order immediately, or I will take the cost out of your quarterly bonus." I didn't cancel the order. I took the hit to my bonus. Sarah, my wife, was still alive then. When I came home that night, furious and exhausted, she poured me a cup of coffee, sat with me at the kitchen table, and told me I did the right thing. She was a former floor manager herself before her health declined, and she always reminded me that the people in those steel-toed boots were the real engine of our wealth. I bit my tongue with my family. I always bit my tongue. Because what my father and Marcus didn't know, and what they had conveniently forgotten due to their own arrogance and a decade of smooth sailing, was the foundational legal reality of our entire business structure. Let's rewind to the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. The ripple effects hit our industry hard around 2010. A massive automotive client went completely bankrupt, owing us over $3 million in unpaid invoices for custom packaging we had already manufactured and delivered. The bank panicked and threatened to call in our primary commercial loan. We were severely over-leveraged because Marcus had convinced my father to buy a fleet of luxury company cars and invest in a catastrophic marketing campaign that yielded zero results. We were weeks away from total foreclosure on the factory property. My father was facing the absolute destruction of his ego and his legacy. Right around that same time, my maternal grandmother passed away. She was a brilliant, sharp-tongued woman who absolutely despised my father for how he had treated my mother before their bitter divorce in the late 90s. She left her entire estate solely to me, bypassing my mother, who was independently wealthy and didn't need it, and explicitly locking my father out of any access. It was a little over $5 million in liquid cash, municipal bonds, and index funds. My father, desperate and terrified, came to my house. He begged me for a loan to save the business. He pleaded. He cried real tears, and he played the family legacy card heavier than I had ever seen. He promised things would change. He promised I would be given an equal share of power. I loved the company, and I loved the workers. I agreed to help, but I was not a fool. I had my own private attorney, a viciously smart corporate lawyer named Higgins, draft the paperwork. I didn't just hand my father a multi-million-dollar check to pay off his debts. Instead, I took $2 million of my inheritance and formed an independent LLC called Caldwell Holdings. My LLC, Caldwell Holdings, formally purchased the physical land, the massive factory building, the heavy machinery, and the vital proprietary manufacturing patents my grandfather had originally filed. The cash from that purchase was used by my father's company to pay off the bank debt in full and escape foreclosure. Then my LLC leased the property, the machines, and licensed the patents back to Caldwell Packaging, the operating company that my dad and brother owned, on a rock-solid 99-year agreement for a very reasonable, below-market monthly fee. My father was so blinded by relief and so desperate for the cash injection that he signed the towering stack of legal papers without reading the fine print. He didn't even have his own lawyers review it properly. He just saw that his day-to-day operating company was saved, his bank accounts were out of the red, and his reputation at the country club was intact. Over the years, because the rent was automatically deducted from the corporate accounts every month, and the business stabilized and became wildly profitable again, my father and Marcus developed selective amnesia. They completely forgot that they didn't actually own the concrete floor they walked on. They forgot they didn't own the patents that made our corrugated design structurally superior. They just viewed me as the annoying, overly empathetic younger brother who handled the dirty work in operations while they played at being titans of industry. Fast forward to January of this year. My father, at 85, finally suffered a health scare. It wasn't a massive heart attack, but it was enough of a cardiac event to land him in the hospital for a week. It was a wake-up call for him, and upon his discharge, he decided it was officially time to step down as CEO and transition to a figurehead chairman role. Sarah had passed away from cancer 2 years prior, and the factory was all I really had left. It was my sanctuary. I'd kept the company highly profitable through a pandemic, a supply chain crisis, and massive inflation. I had modernized our entire logistics network. I had virtually zero turnover on the floor. I believed, foolishly, that this was my moment. I believed my father would finally acknowledge that my soft approach was the reason we were thriving. My dad called a formal family meeting at his sprawling suburban estate. My sister, Elena, who is 58, has never worked a single day in the family business, but happily collects a massive quarterly dividend check to fund her equestrian hobbies, was there. Marcus was there, leaning against the fireplace and swirling a glass of 30-year-old Macallan. "I'm officially stepping down as chief executive," my dad announced, his voice a bit raspy but still dripping with his trademark authority. "And I've spent a lot of time thinking about the new leadership structure. The future of this company requires aggressive expansion. It requires a killer instinct. Therefore, Marcus will be taking over as CEO, effective Monday." I froze in my armchair. The room went completely silent. "Marcus?" I said, trying to keep the tremor of pure rage out of my voice. Dad, Marcus doesn't even know how to recalibrate the die-cutting machines. He doesn't know the supply chain. He hasn't landed a new major account in 3 years. His last initiative cost us $250,000 in useless software licenses. Marcus has vision, my father snapped, defensive immediately. He understands high-level growth. He understands corporate capitalization. You get bogged down in the weeds, Arthur. I run the day-to-day, Dad. You know I do. If I wasn't in that building, this place would grind to a halt in less than a week. Marcus smiled. It was a slick, deeply condescending grin that made my blood boil. Don't be so dramatic, Artie. You're a phenomenal foreman. You're great with the blue-collar guys. They love you. We're keeping you exactly where you belong as director of operations, but you're not a CEO. You don't have the stomach for the hard choices. Why? I demanded, leaning forward and looking directly into my father's eyes. Give me one actual metric, one business reason. My father sighed, looking at me like I was a naive child who had just asked why the sky was blue. Because you're too soft, Arthur. I've told you this for decades. You care too much about the workers. You view them as family, and that is a fatal flaw in business. Business is war, and you're a pacifist. You hesitate. Marcus is a shark. He's going to trim the fat, streamline operations, and double our valuation in 5 years. Elena chimed in, barely looking up from her phone. Just accept it, Arthur. Marcus is better at the executive side. You're good at the warehouse stuff. Don't make a scene and ruin Dad's retirement. I looked at the three of them, my family, my blood. I saw the naked, unearned greed in Marcus's eyes. I saw the dismissive, patriarchal arrogance in my father's posture. I saw the shallow, parasitic self-interest in my sister. I realized in that exact moment that I owed them absolutely nothing. Okay, I said quietly. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and looked at Marcus. Congratulations, Mr. CEO. Let's see what you can do. I walked out. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't flip the table. Because a plan, cold, calculated, and absolutely devastating, was already forming in my mind. Marcus's reign as chief executive officer was an immediate, unmitigated catastrophe. He treated his promotion like a coronation. His grand vision for trimming the fat consisted entirely of draconian cost-cutting measures that instantly destroyed a decade of goodwill and morale. He started by bringing in a sleazy external HR consultant who legally downgraded our health insurance to the absolute lowest, cheapest tier allowable by law. Remember Tom in shipping? His daughter's specialized treatments were suddenly completely out of network. Tom, a proud man in his 50s who had never asked for a handout in his life, came into my office and broke down in tears. He was terrified. I ended up quietly paying his daughter's out-of-pocket medical bills from my own personal accounts, telling Tom it was a legacy employee discretionary fund that I managed. Next, Marcus fired our entire third-party cleaning staff to save $40,000 a year. He issued a company-wide memo stating that the factory workers, men and women who were already exhausting themselves doing heavy physical labor for 10-hour shifts, were now responsible for scrubbing the toilets, mopping the break rooms, and taking out the office trash before they were allowed to clock out. Production slowed down instantly. Quality control plummeted. For the first time in 15 years, we had an order of critical aerospace packaging rejected and sent back because the structural integrity failed testing. Marcus blamed the floor workers and fired 2 guys who had been with us for a decade, completely ignoring the fact that he had recently forced me to switch to a cheaper, inferior supplier for our raw corrugated pulp. The atmosphere in the factory turned toxic. The men stopped smiling when I walked the floor. They looked at me with betrayal in their eyes, assuming I was rubber-stamping these decisions. It broke my heart, but I had to bide my time. I needed to see exactly how far Marcus was willing to go. I got my answer in late April. I was working late on a Thursday evening trying to salvage a logistical nightmare caused by one of Marcus's new, cheap shipping vendors. The executive suites were mostly dark. As I walked down the carpeted hallway to grab some files from the main archive room, I noticed Marcus's office door was slightly ajar. A sliver of light spilled out, and I heard his voice. He was on a speakerphone conference call. I stopped dead in my tracks and listened. Yes, I assure you, the labor force won't be a problem because there is no union, Marcus was saying, his tone dripping with obsequious sleaze. Once the acquisition goes through, you're completely clear to liquidate the Ohio plant. The real value is in moving our proprietary client list and our structural patents to your automated facility in Mexico. I just need confirmation that the payout is structured correctly. The golden parachute for myself and my father needs to be locked in before the board vote. My blood turned to ice. He wasn't just ruining the company. He was selling it. And he wasn't just selling it to a competitor. He was selling it to a predatory private equity firm. They were going to buy the company, shutter the factory, fire all 120 employees without severance, and strip the assets for parts. He was going to destroy the livelihoods of 120 families in our town, gut the local economy, and erase my grandfather's legacy, all so he could secure a massive multi-million-dollar payout and walk away. I quietly pushed the door open and stepped into his office. Marcus was leaning back in his Italian leather chair, his feet on the desk, holding a glass of scotch. He looked up, startled, and fumbled to hit the mute button on the console. "What the hell are you doing creeping around in here?" he snapped, dropping his feet to the floor. "You're selling to private equity," I said flatly, my voice dangerously calm. He stared at me for a second, then his face relaxed into a smug, unapologetic smirk. He took a slow sip of his drink. "I am. It's a $75 million deal, Arthur. Dad and I get $30 million each. Elena gets 15, you get a nice little severance package and your operational pension." "And the workers?" I asked, stepping closer to his desk. "The people who built this place? Maria, Tom, the guys who have given 40 years of their lives to this family?" Marcus rolled his eyes, utterly exasperated. "Collateral damage? That's capitalism, little brother. It's the free market. Like we told you, you're too soft. You're emotionally attached to the help. Take your pension, go buy a boat, and open a soup kitchen if you care so much. I am not letting you sell this company to be butchered, Marcus." He laughed out loud. It was a sharp, barking laugh of pure arrogance. "You don't have a choice, Artie. You have zero power here. Dad and I hold 80% of the voting shares of Caldwell Packaging. You only have 20. The formal board vote is next Friday. It's a done deal. The ink is practically dry. Now get out of my office before I have security escort you off the premises." I didn't say another word. I turned around, walked out of the building, got into my truck, and drove straight to my lawyer's house. It was 10,030 at night, but I didn't care. I pounded on Higgins's front door until he answered in his bathrobe. We went into his study, poured a massive pot of coffee, and pulled the 2010 Caldwell Holdings LLC documents out of his fireproof safe. We stayed up until 4:30 a.m. reviewing every single clause, every subsection, and every contingency. When the sun came up, I knew exactly how I was going to execute the family. The following Friday arrived. The board meeting was a formality. It took place in the grand executive conference room, seated around the massive mahogany table. Present were my father, looking frail but incredibly smug; Marcus, wearing a brand new, custom-tailored suit to celebrate his incoming windfall; my sister Elena, who had dialed in via video call from a spa in Sedona; and a team of 4 slick, merciless corporate lawyers representing Vanguard Capital, the private equity firm. I sat at the far end of the table, wearing my usual slacks and a button-down shirt. The lead Vanguard lawyer, a man who looked like a literal shark in a Tom Ford suit, slid a massive, leather-bound stack of paper across the table toward Marcus. "Gentlemen, this is the finalized acquisition agreement for Caldwell Industrial Packaging," the Vanguard lawyer said smoothly. "Pending the signatures of the majority shareholders today, Vanguard will assume total control of operations, client lists, and all physical and intellectual assets effective immediately. We will begin the liquidation of the Ohio facility on Monday." Marcus already had his gold Mont Blanc fountain pen uncapped and in his hand. My father was beaming, dreaming of his new compound in Florida. "Before anyone signs a single piece of paper," I said, my voice cutting through the smug silence of the room, "there is a massive structural problem with the asset transfer." Marcus glared at me, his pen hovering over the signature line. "Shut up, Arthur. The adults are conducting business. You had your chance to whine. It's over. Let him speak," the Vanguard lawyer said, raising a hand. He looked at me with mild, patronizing amusement. "What seems to be the issue, Arthur?" "If this is about employee severance, Vanguard is not legally obligated to—" "It has nothing to do with severance," I interrupted, reaching down into my battered leather briefcase. I pulled out a single, neatly bound red legal folder. I slid it all the way down the long table until it stopped perfectly in front of the Vanguard lawyer. "You can't buy the factory building," I said. "You can't buy the land it sits on. You can't buy the heavy machinery inside of it. And, most importantly, you cannot buy the 17 patents that make our corrugated packaging legally distinct from our competitors." Marcus slammed his hand on the table. "We own the damn company, you idiot! You own Caldwell Packaging," I corrected him, leaning back in my chair. "Which is just an operating shell. It's a name on a piece of paper. Caldwell Packaging does not own the building we are sitting in. Caldwell Packaging does not own the land outside. Caldwell Packaging does not own the patents required to manufacture our flagship products." My father's face suddenly went pale as a ghost. His jaw dropped slightly. I could see the rusted gears slowly, painfully turning in his 85-year-old brain, rewinding back 12 years to his moment of desperate, tearful financial ruin in my living room. "What the hell is he talking about?" Marcus demanded, looking frantically at our father. "Dad, what is he talking about?" The Vanguard lawyer was no longer amused. He quickly opened the red folder and began speed-reading the documents I provided. His confident, shark-like expression vanished entirely, replaced by a look of deep, professional horror and extreme annoyance. He's right, the Vanguard lawyer said, his voice clipped and cold. He looked furiously at Marcus. According to these filed deeds in the Federal Patent Registry, all physical assets, land, and intellectual property are solely owned by a separate entity called Caldwell Holdings, LLC. Caldwell Packaging merely leases them. So what? Marcus shouted, sweating now. It's a 99-year lease. It transfers with the sale. Just buy the lease. No, it doesn't, the Vanguard lawyer snapped, tapping a specific page with his finger, because according to this document, the 99-year lease was voided in January. Marcus looked like he was going to vomit. Voided? How? I smiled. It was the best smile of my life. Clause 4, subsection B of the 2010 lease agreement. It clearly states that any change in the chief executive officer of the operating company without the express, written, notarized consent of the holding company automatically reverts the 99-year lease to a month-to-month tenancy, a tenancy which can be terminated by the holding company at any time, for any reason, with 30 days written notice. I looked directly into Marcus's terrified eyes. You shouldn't have taken my job, brother. Marcus started hyperventilating. Dad, what is this? Tell them this is fake. I forgot, my father stammered, clutching his chest slightly, his face ashen. It was over a decade ago. We were bankrupt. The bank was at the door. I just signed the papers to get the cash from his grandmother's estate. I forgot. The Vanguard lawyer stood up violently, snapping his briefcase shut. He looked at my father and brother with absolute disgust. We were led to believe we were purchasing a fully integrated turnkey manufacturing entity, the lawyer spat. You are attempting to sell us an empty corporate shell that owns literally nothing except a few office chairs and a liability ledger. You don't even own the machines you use to make the product. This deal is dead. And if you ever attempt to mislead Vanguard Capital again, we will sue you for fraud. The lawyers marched out of the room. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them. The silence in the conference room was deafening. Elena had muted herself on the video call, her mouth hanging open. You, Marcus whispered, his face turning a deep, mottled purple with rage. You little piece of shit. You ruined a $75 million deal. I'll kill you. I'll sue you into the ground. You are going to fire 120 loyal people, Marcus, I said, my voice like steel. You are going to gut this town. You are going to destroy families for a payout you didn't even earn. IT's business, he screamed, lunging across the table. He didn't make it far. He knocked over his chair and fell to his knees. It's over, I said, standing up. I reached into my briefcase one last time and dropped a single sheet of paper onto the center of the mahogany table. This is a formal eviction notice, I stated. Caldwell Packaging has exactly 30 days to vacate my building, remove your personal property from my land, and completely cease using my proprietary patents. And since your operating company has virtually no cash reserves right now because Marcus has been draining them to pay his exorbitant executive bonuses and legal consultation fees, Caldwell Packaging is effectively bankrupt. My father looked up at me, tears streaming down his wrinkled face. But they weren't tears of remorse or understanding. They were tears of pure self-pity and defeated ego. Arthur, he wheezed. Arthur, please. You're destroying the family. You're destroying your grandfather's legacy. No, Dad, I said, buttoning my jacket. I'm saving my grandfather's legacy from you two. I walked out of the conference room, out of the executive suites, and went down to the factory floor one last time. The roar of the machines was deafening. The smell of the pulp was intoxicating. I looked at Tom, who waved at me from the loading dock. I looked at Maria, inspecting a fresh batch of crates. I nodded to them, got in my truck, and went home. Over the next 30 days, absolute, unmitigated chaos consumed my family. Marcus tried to sue me. He hired 3 different law firms, but they all dropped him within a week when they reviewed the 2010 contract and realized he didn't have the personal funds to fight a prolonged, impossible legal battle against an airtight, decade-old agreement drafted by a master of corporate law. My father tried to call me 50 times a day. He left sobbing voicemails begging for mercy. He promised to fire Marcus immediately, strip his shares, and give me the CEO title and full control of the operating company. I blocked his number, blocked Marcus's number, and instructed my lawyer to handle all communications. But the truth was, I didn't want to run the business anymore, not like that. The well was poisoned. The family name was a burden I no longer wished to carry. Instead, I reached out to a fierce competitor across the state. A massive, highly successful manufacturing company that was famous in the industry for being 100% employee-owned, an ESOP employee stock ownership plan. They'd been trying to break into our specific, highly lucrative niche of heavy-duty aerospace packaging for years, but they couldn't bypass our patents without getting sued. I set up a quiet meeting with their board of directors. I offered them the deal of a lifetime. I would sell them Caldwell Holdings LLC in its entirety, the prime industrial land, the massive factory building, the heavy machinery, and every single one of the 17 structural patents for a flat, non-negotiable fee of $4 million. It was a massive, absurd discount. The assets and patents alone were easily worth 15 to 20 million on the open market. But I had one strict, legally binding, non-negotiable condition written into the ironclad contract. They had to immediately hire every single one of the 120 factory workers from the bankrupt Caldwell Packaging. They had to match or exceed their current salaries, completely reinstate premium, top-tier health benefits, honor their decades of tenure for retirement purposes, and immediately integrate them into the employee ownership stock program. They agreed instantly. It was the bargain of the century for them, and they gained a highly skilled, pre-trained workforce. The transition took 3 months. Caldwell Packaging officially went bankrupt. Marcus had his company Porsche repossessed, and he and his young wife had to downsize their lifestyle drastically. My father retreated to his estate, a broken, bitter old man stripped of his empire. The day the new, employee-owned company officially took over operations in the factory, they held a massive town hall meeting on the floor. I stood in the back, near the loading docks. When the new CEO announced that everyone's jobs were completely safe, that Marcus's draconian bathroom cleaning rules were instantly abolished, and that top-tier healthcare was fully restored, and that they were now all part owners of the company they worked for, the cheer that erupted in that warehouse was the loudest, most beautiful sound I have ever heard in my 62 years on this earth. Grown men were crying and hugging each other. Tom from shipping spotted me standing in the back. He walked over, his eyes red. He didn't say a word, he just grabbed me and pulled me into a crushing hug. "I don't know exactly what you did behind the closed doors, Arthur," he choked out, "but you saved my little girl's life. Thank you." "Just doing my job, Tom," I smiled, patting him on the back. "Take care of the place for me." The $4 million cleared into my personal accounts a week later. I didn't need the money. I already had the remaining $3 million from my grandmother's inheritance, which had grown significantly over the last 12 years through quiet, conservative index investing. My house was paid off, my cars were paid off, and my needs were simple, so I did the softest, most pacifist thing I could possibly do. I kept $200,000 to buy a beautiful, secluded little cabin on a quiet lake in upstate Michigan, a place Sarah and I had always talked about retiring to. I took the remaining $308 million from the sale and established the Caldwell Workers Foundation. I set it up as a fully funded, irrevocable trust managed by a third-party board of directors, which included Maria from QA and Tom from shipping. The sole purpose of the trust is to provide emergency financial assistance, zero-interest home mortgages, and full-ride college scholarships specifically for the children and families of the blue-collar factory workers in my hometown. My family found out about the donation through a massive front-page article in the local newspaper that extensively covered the sale of the factory, the salvation of the workers, and the creation of the multi-million-dollar foundation. Elena sent me a furious text message that just said, "You are a psychotic, vindictive socialist." Marcus left a completely unhinged, drunken voicemail at 2 in the morning, calling me every vile name in the English language, screaming that I had stolen his millions and given it to uneducated white trash forklift drivers. My father went the old-fashioned route. He wrote me a letter. It was 2 pages long, typed on his personal embossed stationery. It detailed exactly how deeply I had betrayed my own blood, how I had spat on and disrespected my grandfather's legacy, and how I was officially, permanently, no longer his son. I read it while sitting in a rocking chair on the wooden porch of my new cabin, looking out at the calm, glassy water of the lake as the sun went down. I read every word. Then I folded it up, struck a match, and used it to light the evening fire in my fire pit. I am 62 years old. I am unemployed. I live in a cabin in the woods with my golden retriever. My family absolutely despises me, and I am entirely, happily cut out of their toxic, greedy lives. And for the first time in my entire existence, I sleep completely through the night. I guess they were absolutely right about me all along. I really was just too soft for the corporate world. But as I watched the fire crackle, knowing that 120 hardworking families in Ohio can sleep easy tonight without fear of ruin, I think I'm perfectly fine with that. Let the sharks eat each other. The soft guys will inherit the earth.